Between January and March 2023, I delivered a course of lectures on the Crusades. Here is the 8th of these lectures, in which I describe and explain the rise of Venice and the role of Venice in the Crusades. It is not an edifying story. It is, however, a story of how a most remarkable people were able to conceive their interests and then to get what they wanted and to keep what they got. If you find this lecture useful or merely interesting, you may wish to follow the link at the foot of the video description on YouTube and buy me a bag of coffee. I like coffee. The more coffee I drink, the more lectures I shall give. Now to the rise of Venice. Today we will talk about the rise of Venice. And here is rather a fine cover slide, a painting from the 16th century of one of the early doges of Venice. It's by Tintoretto. It's Peter II and his son Otto. And Peter II was Doge of Venice between 992 and 1009. A very important period in the early history of Venice as it began to move towards commercial supremacy in Western Europe. Let us, though, go back to the beginnings of Venice, which are lost in the mists of time. The tradition, to which we can give little credence, but the tradition is that Venice was founded on the 25th of March, 421, and it was soon filled with refugees from the other cities in northern Italy, which had been destroyed by the invasions of the Huns and Goths. So Venice, by legend, is founded during the closing years of the Western Roman Empire. It was a city on the northeastern coast of Italy, a very good location for building a city at this time. Let us have a look at the map. There we are, the top right of the slide. You have the territory of the Republic of Venice, but Venice itself, if you look at the bottom left part of the slide, is built around a lagoon. And these lagoons themselves are protected from the mainland of Italy by various marshes. At this time in the early 5th century, there are barbarian armies wandering around Italy, looting and burning and generally making life difficult. Venice is a nice out-of-the-way place as a refuge. It is a coastal city, it is protected by marshes. It means that it is effectively untakeable from the land because those marshes are pestilential places. You get an army in to besiege Venice and they'll soon be thinned out by various epidemic diseases like malaria. So Venice is protected by nature from the troubles that were besetting Italy at this time. But Venice is also just north of Ravenna, which at this time was the capital city in the Western Roman Empire. The last Western emperors moved the capital, first of all from Rome, which is a most inconvenient place if you are looking out for invasions across the Rhine, moved from Rome to Milan, which is much closer to the Alps. And then, as northern Italy became unsafe, the emperors relocated to Ravenna, which has the same advantages as Venice. It's a coastal city and it's surrounded by marshes. It cannot easily be taken from the land side, and from the seaside it has excellent communications with the east and with Constantinople. So Venice is built on the extreme fringe of Italy. It is protected by nature from the troubles that overwhelmed Italy. And that is how Venice formed. We can't say that it was founded. It formed. It formed from a set of coastal villages which had a useful strategic location, and it was just north of Ravenna, and so it was protected by the Byzantine fleet, because even after the end of the Western Empire, for a while Ravenna was ruled by the Goths, and then from the 540s onwards it was the capital of Italy, the exarch of Italy, the emperor's governor of Italy lived and functioned in Ravenna, and Venice benefited from this. It benefited from the protection of the Byzantine fleet, and it also benefited from the proximity of a large and wealthy imperial city. And there Venice remained for the next few centuries as a growing but still small collection of fishing villages. Until about 800 AD, Venice was on the edge of the civilized world. Western Europe, after about 400, suffered very badly from the periodic warming and cooling of the planet, or rather, Western Europe suffered very badly after about 400 AD from a progressive cooling of the Earth. And here is a chart which shows this. We can argue over the extent of warming and cooling, and we can argue over when the swings began and ended. But this is an approximate map, an approximate chart, showing the periodic changes of temperature during the past 5,000 years or thereabouts. So you have a very warm period at the end of the Bronze Age, followed by a sudden cooling, which is associated with the collapse of Bronze Age civilization. You then have a warming period, which began around the birth of Christ and continued until about 200 AD. This is the period of stability and wealth for the Roman Empire. The Dark Ages, or so we call them, the Dark Ages are associated with the cooling period brought on by changes in the radiation from the sun, of a nature that we don't fully understand, and also exacerbated by a number of volcanic eruptions. This was quite a sharp cooling period. It is during this period that civilization in Western Europe collapsed. It went into serious decline all over the world, but in Western Europe, civilization appears to have collapsed. This cooling period came to an abrupt end around 750, and from 800 onwards, you have the emergence of what has been called the medieval warm period, which peaked in about 1300 with temperatures somewhat higher than they are today. So until 800 or thereabouts, Venice was on the edge of the civilized world. After about 800 AD, with the improvement of climate, Western Europe began to recover. And it was not simply a recovery. The people of Western Europe were not the passive beneficiaries of a more benign climate. You also have the beginning of a set of technological, legal, and social developments in Western Europe that would gradually transform Western Europe from the edge or slightly beyond the edge of the civilized world into the center of the civilized world. You have, after 800, the gradual emergence of powerful states in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire. You have the emergence of Italy, or the re-emergence of Italy, as not part of a unified empire anymore, but as a confederation of wealthy and powerful independent commercial republics. By about 1000, you have the Rhine and the Danube as the places which were home to 4 of the 5 largest cities in Western Europe, places like Cologne, Ulm, and so on. And so Europe, by about 1000, by about 1000, is on the edge of the late medieval transformation. And this leads very quickly, by about 1200, to a very significant scientific and industrial revolution. Not on the same scale as the great scientific and industrial revolutions that took place after 1600, but they laid the foundations of these later developments. You have developments in steel smelting and clockmaking and lens grinding. You have the establishment of large and powerful feudal kingdoms which were able to keep the peace within their borders and to fight off any external attacks. You have a slow spread of paper and of literacy, and you have expanding cities. And all this is enabled, it's not caused, but it's enabled by the return of a more benign climate throughout the world. Here on the right, you have a set of conjectural statistics, because that's all we can have for this period, showing the recovery of population after the long cooling period of the early Middle Ages. This is one of the causes of the rise of Venice. Until about 800, Venice was, as I keep on saying, on the edge of the civilized world. By about 1000, by about 1000 AD, Venice was at the center of the civilized world. It was the point of contact between the East and the West. If we go back to the map with which I opened, you can see that Venice is at the topmost point of Italy, and from Venice it's a fairly short jump to the Rhine and to the Danube. You have a series of rivers and eventually of canals and of roads which connect Venice to the great rivers of Central Europe, and from there Venice can be in touch with France, with England, with the Low Countries, with anywhere you care to mention. So Venice is a very important outlet from Western Europe to the Mediterranean world, and a very important inlet from the Mediterranean world into Central and Western Europe. So after about 800 AD, Venice begins to emerge as one of the main trading centres in a reviving Western Europe. There was a slow transformation of Venice from an economy based on fishing to an economy based on trade. And the initial growth of Venice as a trading centre was as one of the main slave trading centres in the northern Mediterranean. Slaves would be captured in Central and Northern Europe in the various wars of conquest of this age. They would be sold into the markets in Venice, and then they'd be exported to the Islamic world. And there was a strong taste in the Islamic world for eunuchs, for castrated slaves, and Venice early emerged as one of the specialist suppliers of this market. There were large castrating sheds in Venice where young boys from Northern Europe would be brought in chains. They'd be castrated, nursed back to health if required, and then packed off to various harems in North Africa and Egypt and other points east. That was the early success of Venice, a slave trading centre. Then in the 10th century, you have a continued growth or a continued regrowth of the Mediterranean economy. And this is combined with a recovery of Byzantine power after the low point of the 7th and early 8th centuries. The Byzantines re-established their control over the eastern Mediterranean. They retake Crete, Cyprus, and parts of Syria, and they squash Islamic piracy out of North Africa. This clears the eastern Mediterranean to trade between Venice and the empire. So you have a rebirth of commercial sea operations. You have a rebirth of naval trade in the eastern Mediterranean, from which Venice is one of the prime beneficiaries. At this time, until the middle of the 11th century, Venice is a satellite of the Byzantine Empire. It is the main outlet for the empire into Central and Western Europe. It is the place to which Western merchants flock in order to take advantage of the revived and continuously reviving trade with the East. So around 1000 AD, around 1000, Venice has been transformed from a collection of fishing villages into a large and growing commercial city. It is the main naval power in the Adriatic because it's necessary for the Republic of Venice to maintain control over the Adriatic in order to deter the remaining Islamic pirates. It is here, and it is around this time, that you can talk about the birth of capitalism. Now, there have always been markets, there's always been trade, people have always been buying and selling, and the laws of supply and demand have always operated. It is part of human nature. But by around 1000, Venice is what is technically called a high trust society. It doesn't mean that the Venetians were all scrupulously honest people and that you could do business with them in perfect security, that you would not in some way be ripped off. That's pushing it a bit too far. No, when we talk about a high trust commercial society, we're talking about a series of institutional developments. In Western Europe and in the Empire, in the Byzantine Empire and in the various Islamic kingdoms, you do not have this high trust society. What you have is very powerful political institutions which are able to lean on merchants, which can every so often bankrupt entire mercantile communities. Venice does not have that. Venice is a republic. There is a doge or a senior magistrate who is elected for life by an oligarchy of merchants and aristocrats. The powers of the doge are balanced by 2 tribunes elected annually, and so there is no institutional conflict in Venice between the commercial and the agricultural interests. And unlike in Western Europe, unlike in the Byzantine Empire, and unlike in the Islamic states, the political institutions of the Republic do not float above the mercantile interest, able, as and when the political authorities think convenient, to step in and make life difficult for the merchants. The Republic is run by the mercantile interests. There is no conflict between the mercantile and the political interest in Venice because the two are fused. There are low taxes on mercantile profits, and these low taxes are reliable. It doesn't rely on a single enlightened ruler who will then be replaced by his insane son, who confiscates all the property of the merchants. Again, the merchants are part of the political government of the Republic. So you have low taxes on commercial profits and great security of property. And this allows for the steady reinvestment of profits and thereby for the accumulation of wealth. This allows the possibility, it allows the legal and general circumstantial possibility for the emergence of trading corporations. This is where money and skills are pooled. Now, this does not cause things. We're not talking about mechanical cause and effect, as in the natural world. It enables certain developments which can take place, but which might not take place. But in Venice, over the 3 centuries after about 1000 AD, these developments did take place. You have the appearance of what is called the Joint Stock Limited Liability Corporation, something I'll come to in a moment. You have the emergence of stock exchanges and secondary financial markets. You have the appearance of legal devices like bills of exchange, mortgages, other financial instruments. You then have the very important development of bankruptcy laws, which for the first time are able to distinguish between illiquidity and actual insolvency. You may suffer a cash flow problem. You have assets which are sufficient to cover all of your liabilities, but you have a temporary cash flow problem. That's illiquidity. Or you may be insolvent. You may not, at any point in the future, be able to cover your debts. Venetian law, for the first time, was able to distinguish between these two states, and it had devices for dealing with both. With illiquidity, there was the possibility of refinancing. With insolvency, there was the liquidation of the assets of a corporation to pay the creditors something of what they were owed. You have the use of algebra for currency conversions, the beginning of deposit banking, and the Venetians also begin the custom of setting up local agents in all their main places of business. All of this comes about because of long-distance trade between Venice and Constantinople, trade between Venice and Alexandria, trade between Venice and Bruges and Cologne, and eventually London and York, and of course trade with the Islamic powers, and even trade with India and with China. Let me turn to these corporations. They're called the colleganza. Long-range trade is attended by risk. In the first place, there is the time it takes. If you send a ship from Venice to Constantinople, you need 3 weeks for the purchase of stock and the loading of the ships. You then need to get the ships from Venice to Constantinople, which at the best of times can take a week. There's then further unloading in Constantinople and reloading, and then a return to Venice. So it is a 2-month round trip between Venice and Constantinople. If all goes well, there's a profit of at least 100% on initial investment. If, however, the ship is taken by pirates, or there's shipwreck, or there's an outbreak of plague which prevents the ship from docking and unloading, there can be a big loss for everyone concerned. You then have the cost of building and fitting out a merchant ship, and that was enormous. You need very deep pockets to be able to undertake that kind of expense. So the solution was the colleganza. It was the formation of a set of contracts between active and passive investors. The active investor was the merchant, who would undertake the voyage and undertake the risk, the physical risk of the voyage. And the passive investors, people who put up the money to pay for the voyage. A typical colleganza agreement involved little or no financial investment by the merchant who undertook the trade. Instead, the investors would put up the whole cost of fitting the ship and buying cloth from the Low Countries. The merchant would then sail east. He would sell his cloth in Constantinople or in Alexandria, He'd load up with pepper, silk, whatever, and return to Venice. And if all went well, there was this large 100% plus profit, and this would go about a quarter to the merchant and 3/4 to the investors. If the voyage brings a loss, if the ship sinks or the ship is captured or anything else goes wrong, and if there is a total loss, that financial loss is borne by the investors, but the investors are only liable for the loss up to the value of their initial investment. There is nothing like joint and several liability where all of the investors are equally liable for the whole of the loss. What will happen is that you put up 1,000 ducats as your part of the investment. If the voyage is a catastrophic loss and there is no profit of whatever kind, then you lose your 1,000 ducat investment, but no one can come to you and say, well, come along, everyone else has gone bankrupt, but you still have a house, you still have some land outside the city, sell that because you're liable now to cover the losses. None of that. There is limited liability for the investors. These contracts and others like them depend on the pre-existence of certain legal institutions and business practices. Those make these contracts easy to understand and easy to enforce, but the emergence of these colleganza agreements and others of their kind also allow the continued evolution of other legal institutions and other legal practices. Although you can't talk about an economic takeoff in modern terms, it doesn't compare with the emergence of England as a great commercial power after about 1660. It certainly doesn't compare with the growth of China since the early 1980s. But in terms of the Middle Ages, this is a sudden and unprecedented economic takeoff, and Venice becomes one of the largest and the richest cities in the Mediterranean world, and indeed one of the largest and richest cities in the civilized world. So Venice grows within about 200 years from a loose collection of fishing villages and slave depots on the northern shores of the Adriatic into a great commercial republic. And this brings us to the emergence of Venice as a great power within the Mediterranean world. As I said, until the middle of the 11th century, Venice was a satellite of the Byzantine Empire. But, to go back over some of the stuff we covered in the first session, in 1071, there was a sudden collapse of Byzantine power in the Near East. The empire lost most of its Asia Minor provinces. At the same time, the empire was attacked by the Normans in Italy. The Normans invaded Western Greece and tried to carve out new domains from the imperial provinces in the Balkans. And there's not much that the empire can do to stop the Normans, because the empire's main emphasis is on defending itself from continued Turkish advances, or perhaps on recovering its lost Asian provinces. It has very few resources to put into resisting the Norman attacks in the west. The empire is on the edge of collapse, but in 1081, Alexius Comnenus, one of the great Byzantine emperors, comes to power in a coup, and he sets about a very largely successful restoration of the empire. The problem for Alexius, and I think I covered this or I touched on it in the first session, is that one of the reasons for the Byzantine collapse is that the Byzantine ruling class, largely of landowners and bureaucrats, has no interest in raising large national armies and navies. These are fundamentally uncontrollable by the ruling class. They will allow an ambitious emperor to establish his own complete domination. The ruling class is not interested in allowing Alexius to raise large internal armed forces. That means that he needs to look outside the empire for the recruitment of mercenaries or the making of useful alliances. When Alexius wanted to drive the Normans out, there are some maps. There on the right is the Byzantine Empire in around 1025, a large and powerful and very compact Greek Orthodox nation-state dominating much of the Near East. And there is the Byzantine Empire on the right in 1081. It's lost virtually the whole of its Asian provinces, and it's now confined to the Balkan Peninsula. Alexius wants to reach out and to reconquer as much of Asia Minor as he can to re-establish the bases of Byzantine hegemony in the Near East. But to do that, he needs external help. In order to drive the Normans out from his western provinces, from the provinces of western Greece, it is necessary to find an ally with sufficient naval power to give support to the imperial armies. The most obvious ally for this purpose is the Republic of Venice. And here is Anna Komnena, the daughter of Alexius. Consequently, Alexius was afraid, and considering the magnitude of the task before him, and realizing that the forces at his command were only equal to a small fraction of Robert's, that is, the Norman ruler, he solicited the aid of the Venetians. Some things he promised, and others he offered to give at once, provided that they would equip their whole navy and with all speed sail to Dyrrhachium, with the object firstly of protecting the city and secondly of engaging in battle with Robert's fleet. And if they carried out his request and by God's help gained the victory, or, as may happen, they were defeated, even then they should receive all he had promised, just the same as if they had conquered, and all their desires, provided only they were not injurious to the Roman Empire, should be fulfilled and confirmed by golden bulls. On hearing this, the Venetians signified their desires through their ambassadors and received definite promises. Thereupon they got their navy ready with every kind of ship and started for Dyrrhachium in good order. The authorities in Venice were approached by the imperial ambassadors and offered, "You can have anything you want as long as you make your navy available for a combined operation against the Normans." The Venetians looked at this and said, "How many ships do you want and for how long?" And they poured out their entire navy into the service of the empire. And this brought about the total defeat of the Normans. They were never again a serious threat to the western provinces of the Byzantine Empire. The Venetians also oversaw the bribing of various Norman enemies in Italy, until by 1095 there was no more Norman threat in the west. And this was the standard Byzantine approach to dealing with stronger or just very inconvenient enemies. You bribe or otherwise entice other powers into alliance and then let them do the fighting, and you reap the main benefits. However, this was a different kind of agreement. The last point, reaping the main benefits, was suddenly off the table. Alexius and his ministers didn't realize that although they could bring in the Venetians to help them, and the Venetians would do most of the fighting, the Byzantines would not be able to reap the main benefits this time because Alexius and his ministers have lost touch with developments in the West. Here is a set of pictures I like showing. On the left, you have Western Europe as seen from Constantinople. A howling desert of barbarians, violent but simple-minded and hard-fighting barbarians who can be brought into service as and when required and then sent away again, either with or without whatever had been promised to them. When Alexius sent west for help against the Normans and against the Turks, he and his ministers assumed they were dealing with something like the people on the left, whereas in fact they were dealing with people rather like those on the right. These are people who know their interests, and they know how to get what they want, and they know how to keep it. And that is the Republic of Venice with which Alexius went into his alliance. Let me take up with Anna Komnena again. Then they, the Venetians, sent word to the emperor of the brilliant victory they had gained over Robert, the ruler of the Normans. He paid their services by liberal gifts and preferments, and honoured the Doge of Venice with the title of Protosebastos, or junior emperor, and with the salary attached. And on the patriarch he bestowed the title of Hypertimius, or greatly honoured, massively honest indeed, with its corresponding salary. All very nice, and I'm sure the Doge and the Patriarch were very pleased with the titles, and the salary doubtless came in useful as well. But here we come to the critical point. He also gave the Venetians all the wharves in Constantinople running from the old Hebraic anchorage to that called Bigla, and all the anchorages between these two, as well as much real property, not only in the capital and in the town of Dyrrhachium, but wherever they asked for it. But greatest of all, he ordered that their merchants should not be taxed in any of the countries under Roman sway, so that they could trade freely where they liked and not pay even an obol, neither for customs nor for any other tax required by the treasury, but should be exempt from all Roman authority. What that means is that in return for the very substantial naval help given by the Venetians in the Adriatic, Alexius has given the Venetians commercial privileges throughout the entire empire. These commercial privileges were chiefly that Venetian merchants would not have to pay any of the imperial customs duties. These customs duties were still payable by Greek merchants within the empire. That meant that within about a generation, the Venetians had taken over the whole marine trade of the Byzantine Empire. They used these commercial privileges to their fullest possible effect. It also meant that within about a generation, there were large and largely autonomous Venetian districts in Constantinople and every other city in the empire. By 1182, a century after these agreements were made, there were 20,000 Venetians settled in Constantinople alone, and these were a state within a state. They were not subject to imperial tax collection, and they were not subject to imperial law. This was seen quite early as a difficulty, and when Alexius I died in 1118, and he was succeeded by his son John II, there was an attempt to claw back some of those trading privileges. John refused to renew the trading and fiscal privileges granted in 1082, but in 1124, the Republic of Venice declared war on the empire. It invaded Rhodes, Chios, Samos, Lesbos, Andros, and they capture Kephallonia in the Ionian Sea. In 1126, John II, the son of Alexius, had to give in and renew all of the Republic's commercial privileges. So Byzantium remained a great power for the next half century at least, but it was fast becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of the Republic of Venice. There on the left is a Venetian ducat minted in the 16th century. You can see the Doge of Venice on the right, kneeling before St. Mark, the patron saint of the city. To call the Venetians atheists would be an absurdity, but the Venetians took perhaps a looser view of religion than many other peoples in Western Europe. Religion and commercial advantage tended to be rather intertwined in the Venetian mind. What about Venice and the Crusades? In the First Crusade, Venice played either no part or a very limited part. The Venetians took no part in the capture of Jerusalem. Doubtless they grew richer from supplying the Crusaders with various necessities on their long march south along the coast, but they did not take an active part in the First Crusade or the capture of Jerusalem. Indeed, why should they? The Venetians were interested in trade. They were not interested in the disruption of the existing trading networks in the Near East, and the First Crusade did promise some degree of disruption. However, as soon as the Kingdom of Jerusalem was an established fact, the Venetians did begin to take an interest in the new kingdom. And in 1100, you have the arrival of a fleet of 200 Venetian ships off Jaffa. The Franks are besieging Jaffa. They are desperate for naval support because they have no navy of their own. They need to secure their existing gains. And remember, Baldwin I of the Kingdom of Jerusalem needs to expand his control over the coastal cities. And the Venetians have a navy, and they are able to give all necessary naval support. So the standard deal is made. The Venetians give their full naval support in exchange for tax exemption within the whole Kingdom of Jerusalem, not just the coastal cities, but all the cities in the kingdom. These agreements were regularized after 1122. The Venetians were promised further commercial privileges if they would help Baldwin II capture Tyre. The deal was that all the existing trading and fiscal rights were confirmed. The Venetians received 1/3 of Tyre. They also received a street, a bakery, a bathhouse, and a church in every city within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And in exchange for that, the Venetians give their usual good service. In May 1123, destroyed an Egyptian fleet and they capture Accra. And then in July 1124, the Latins and the Venetians together capture Tyre. Here, the Venetians ensure that there is no massacre. They're not interested in religious cleansing. They're interested in trade, and they don't really want to see their business partners murdered. So they ensure no massacre. Instead, they take over the city of Tyre and use it as a base for their deeper penetration of the eastern markets. After the siege and capture of Tyre, the Venetians are sailing home, and just by the by, they encounter a Byzantine fleet and they sink that as well. So the Venetians are now closely involved with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and for this purpose, in the Second and Third Crusades, they give very lavish naval support in exchange for the usual price. Indeed, the Third Crusade, the one overseen by Richard the Lionheart of England, would not have been possible without continuous Venetian naval support. Wherever needed, there was a Venetian fleet ready to ship in supplies and ready to fight off any Islamic fleet. There on the right is a map of Tyre. In ancient times, the city of Tyre was effectively an island joined to the Syrian mainland by a causeway. And if you know anything about the life of Alexander the Great, it took him 9 months to break into Tyre and to take it. By the High Middle Ages, Tyre was connected to the Syrian coast. There was no need for a causeway. There's been some movement of the land, and Tyre is now part of Syria. But it still juts out into the Mediterranean. It's still very easy to defend, and it is a highly valuable place for doing business. There on the left is a representation of the combined naval and military operations that took Tyre, and the Venetians were entirely responsible for the naval side of that combined operation. Now, by the late 12th century, the Byzantine Empire is again in serious trouble, and this appears to be terminal trouble. Venice and the empire have been commercially entwined for the better part of a century, but these close commercial relations are combined by a souring of political relations. The wealth of the empire has been appropriated. It's been cornered by 3 groups. You have a land-hungry nobility which is dispossessing the independent peasantry and undermining the entire social base of the empire. You have a bloated and corrupt bureaucracy which is bleeding the taxpayers white. And then you have these untaxed and privileged commercial traders. The Greeks will put up with the first 2 because they are being oppressed by their own people, but they don't like subordination to people that until recently they'd regarded as unlettered barbarians and who are still, in their eyes at least, heretics and of course foreigners. The emperors in the first instance tried to establish a balance of power between various commercial groups within the empire. So Manuel II, he began to cultivate other Italian cities like Genoa and Pisa, extending similar trading privileges. The hope was to play off the Italian republics against each other. To some extent this worked, but of course for everything that was very important, although they might fight each other in Italy and on the seas, the Italian commercial republics found that their interests often coincided against the empire, and so they tended to work together against the empire in any serious dispute. Trying to establish a balance of power did not work terribly well in the longer term. In 1170, there was an outbreak of communal warfare in Constantinople between the Venetian and Genoese traders. The Venetians were blamed for this, and in 1171, Manuel imprisoned all the Venetians, confiscated their property, and revoked all their trading privileges. The Venetians didn't emerge from this very well in the short term. There was a war between Venice and Byzantium, but the Venetians were hobbled by a sudden outbreak of plague, and they lost the war and had to sue for peace. But it didn't mean that Venice had gone away. There was a restoration of friendship in the 1180s, but cooperation thereafter is at best rather strained. You then have what's called the Andronicus interlude. In 1182, Andronicus made himself emperor in a coup, a man of great brilliance who understood exactly what the problems of the empire were. He wanted to solve all of those problems at once. He decided to cut the nobility down to size by mass executions and confiscations. He then turned on the bureaucracy with vicious laws against corruption and sales of offices, and the executions that came about thereby even extended into the imperial family. He also ordered a massacre of the entire Italian mercantile community or communities in Constantinople. This was too much, and the Italians appear to have commissioned a counter-coup against Andronicus in 1185. Andronicus was then tortured to death horribly over 3 days, and the next emperor, Isaac II, was weak and largely in the pockets of the Italian merchants. It didn't help that this coincided with another military collapse of the empire in its Asian provinces. This now brings us to the Fourth Crusade. Remember, Richard I oversaw the Third Crusade, but Richard had to leave the Holy Land. He made a provisional treaty with Saladin, which re-established a Kingdom of Jerusalem, minus its capital in Jerusalem. This was a provisional treaty that was supposed to last for only 3 years, but Richard never returned, which left much unfinished work, or what was seen as unfinished work, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Everybody thought that there should be a Fourth Crusade. In 1198, Pope Innocent III is crowned. He's one of the great medieval popes. He's the man who excommunicated King John, which led to the emergence of trial by jury in England. He's also the man who excommunicated the men who forced John to sign the Magna Carta. He's the man who humbled the German emperor at Canossa. Another crusade was very much on his list of things to do. Innocent's idea was to take Egypt, and as I said last week, that is not such a fanciful idea because Egypt at this time was largely Christian, and if it were to be taken, it could be held, and it would then be valuable support for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was the key to the gates of Jerusalem. But this was not the best time for another crusade. 1199, Richard I of England dies. John, his brother, is now king, and he has no interest whatever in taking up the cross. 1199 as well, Philip II of France, all under a papal interdict imposed by Innocent because of Philip's bigamous marriage. The Holy Roman Empire was without an agreed ruler, and because of difficulties within and with the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople was no longer viable as the main gathering point for a Crusader army. But despite this, Innocent preached the Fourth Crusade in 1202. Because it's no longer possible to send an army overland through the empire via Constantinople, it's necessary for this to be a naval operation, and the most obvious point of departure for this naval operation is Venice. The Venetians agree that they will enable this crusade. For a mere 85,000 marks of silver, they will transport 30,000 crusaders from Venice to the Holy Land, or rather from Venice to Alexandria, which they will take and then use to shore up the Kingdom of Jerusalem. However, the Crusaders are short of money and are only able to pay 50,000 marks of the agreed price of 85,000. The Venetians are not notably generous in matters of payment, but they agree to forget the extra 35,000 marks if the Crusaders will retake Zara, which is now in Croatia, and this was presently held by the King of Hungary, who was also one of the Crusaders. This was not on Innocent's own agenda. As soon as Zara was taken and the King of Hungary was thereby outraged, Innocent excommunicated the entire crusade as a punishment, But the leaders of the crusade, that is the Venetians, managed to suppress the bull of excommunication, so it never reached the ordinary crusader soldiers. So everything is ready for departure to Egypt, but the Venetians have one other job that they want performed before the descent on Egypt. And here it gets rather complex, because there are so many people here called Alexius. In 1195, Isaac II, who was in the pockets of the Venetians, was deposed and blinded by his brother, who became Alexius III. In 1203, Isaac's son, that is the son of the blinded emperor, he's also called Alexius. He arrives in Zara, which the Crusaders had just captured for Venice. He promises money to the Crusaders and to the Republic of Venice if the Crusaders will put his father and him back on the throne in Constantinople. The Venetians agree to this. In 1203 again, the Venetian fleet ships the entire Fourth Crusade not to Alexandria in Egypt, but to Constantinople. And there on the right is a map showing the route of the Crusaders. And notice that everywhere the Crusaders landed was taken for the Venetians and handed over to the Venetians. The Crusaders turned up under the walls of Constantinople, where Isaac and his son retook power from Alexius III. But unfortunately, the empire is bankrupt, and Isaac II and his son Alexius are unable to hand over the agreed fee to the Venetians and the Crusaders, or rather, they're unable to pay the Venetians what they've promised. Then, in January 1204, there was a coup in Constantinople by yet another Alexius. He's crowned Alexius V. Isaac, the old emperor, dies of shock in prison, and Alexius IV, his son, the man who turned up in Zara with promises of money, is strangled in prison. Alexius, the new emperor, who was no party to the original agreement, repudiated the whole deal with the Venetians and told the Venetians and the Crusaders under the walls, "Do your worst." He shut the gates and prepared for a siege. However, the Doge of Venice was now there with the Venetian fleet. Although he's about 80 years old, and although he's blind, he takes personal charge of this diverted crusade and arranges for a regular siege of the city. The Venetians have now decided that they will take over the whole of the Byzantine Empire for themselves. They will no longer be the leading financial power within the empire. They will take over its political institutions. So there's a siege of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade. Doubtless many of these people are asking, so when are we going to Alexandria? And the Venetian answer was, soon. Very, very soon. Just get on with this siege. In the 5th century, when the Huns were a serious problem, the imperial government in Constantinople had built the great walls of Theodosius, state-of-the-art defences, the ancient world's last answer to the problem of defending a city. 3 miles of walls, a triple layer of defence all along the land side of Constantinople. These were later joined by sea walls that protected the city from the sea. But these walls were not in good repair. For many centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been the main power in the Near East. There was no danger to Constantinople, and so no need to keep the walls in good repair. And then, more recently, the empire had been in serious financial difficulties, and there was no money to keep the walls in good repair, even now that some repair was needed. The empire also had no navy, nothing able to sail out of the Golden Horn to defeat a besieging navy. The Byzantines are holed up in Constantinople with no navy and with crumbling walls, and on the 12th of April 1204 there was a great Venetian and Crusader assault on the city. The Venetian ships came close enough to the sea walls to swing masts over them so that men could clamber across the masts onto the walls and then seize the towers, and some of the Crusader knights managed to squeeze through holes in the sea wall. At this point, the Crusaders entered the city, and you had several days of vicious street fighting. This is an immense city. It's the largest and richest city in the entire Western world, and it takes a lot of street fighting before the Crusaders could claim control of it. The only regular defence of the city within the streets was the Varangian Guard, which was mostly made up of English mercenaries. They put up a desperate defence with repeated counterattacks, but they're outnumbered and slaughtered. The Emperor Alexius V, yes, there are too many Alexiuses in this story, but Alexius V departed from the city that night and escaped into the countryside. He was later captured by the Crusaders and tortured to death. And what you now have is a ruthless and systematic destruction of the city. Here are the accounts. Here is Niketas Kondriates, an eyewitness, a Byzantine writer. While in the past many conflagrations had taken place in the city, the fires ignited at this time proved all the others to be but sparks. The shifting winds urged the fire first one direction and then another. Like a river, it broke into tributaries and then reconverged upon itself. Columns, statues, great structures went up in smoke like so much brushwood. Nothing could stand before those flames. Geoffrey de Villeroydun, a Western eyewitness, reports, "The Crusaders across the Golden Horn also looked on the deadly blaze in awe and sorrow. The barons were extremely grieved and filled with pity, seeing the great churches and the rich palaces melting and collapsing, and the great streets filled with merchandise burning in the flames, but they could do nothing." It was in this sack of Constantinople, which left the entire centre of the city as a heap of smouldering ruins, that about 90% of classical Greek literature went up irrecoverably in smoke. The city had been the repository of ancient civilization for the better part of 1,000 years. Immense libraries, many of the great works of ancient art had been carried off from temples throughout Greece and Italy to Constantinople, where they were set up in public. These were pulled down and melted for coin. The churches were stripped of relics. Everything was stolen. And John Julius Norwich says, "While the Frenchmen and Flemings abandoned themselves in a frenzy of wholesale destruction, the Venetians kept their heads. They knew beauty when they saw it. They too looted and pillaged and plundered, but they did not destroy. Instead, all that they could lay their hands on they sent back to Venice, beginning with the 4 great bronze horses which had dominated the imperial hippodrome since the days of Constantine. The north and south faces of St. Mark's are also studded with sculptures and reliefs shipped back at the same time. Within, in the north transept, hangs the miraculous icon of the Virgin Nicopoia, the bringer of victory, which the emperors used to carry before them into battle, while the treasury of St. Mark's possesses one of the greatest collections of Byzantine works of art to be found anywhere, a further monument to Venetian rapacity." So at the end of the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople has been taken and ruthlessly looted and burned. And here in Venice is some of the plunder. There are the 4 great horses, probably 6th century BC bronzes made in Corinth, which were shipped to Rome in about 146 BC after the Romans burned Corinth. They then made their way by some process of which we're unaware to Constantinople, and then in 1204 they were taken back to Italy, where they've remained ever since, though in 1992 one of them was sent for an exhibition in the British Museum, and I was able to see it then. There on the right you have a porphyry statue of some of the colleagues of the Emperor Diocletian. The Venetians have taken Constantinople, and they are now in full possession of what remains of the Byzantine Empire. In the first instance, the purple, the imperial title, was offered to the Doge, to Enrico Dandolo, but he refused it. He was old, he was blind, but more than that, it did not suit the commercial or strategic purpose of the Venetians to take over the empire so directly. Dandolo crowned Baldwin I as the first of the Latin emperors of Constantinople, and then the Venetians went home. But there is what the Venetians got from the destruction of the Byzantine Empire. They got a string of coastal regions all along what had been the Byzantine Empire. They took Crete. They took various parts of the empire. The rest of it they handed out to the Crusaders themselves, who carved out various feudal kingdoms which lasted for the next half-century. But the Venetians were the big winners from the Fourth Crusade. At the end of 1204, the Fourth Crusade was dissolved and the Crusaders went home, and they had never set foot once in the Holy Land, but Venice was content. Innocent III in Rome was outraged. He excommunicated everyone in sight, including Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, almost hysterical with outrage and horror at what had been done. But there was nothing he could do about it. The Byzantine Empire had been destroyed, and what remained of it was now dominated by the Venetians. Although the Venetians had no interest in direct political rule, the Venetian ambassador was now the most important man in Constantinople, and until they were dislodged by a restoration or a semi-restoration of the Byzantine Empire in 1261, whatever the Latin emperor was told to do by the Venetian ambassador, he would do. So the big winners of the Fourth Crusade, the only winners of the Fourth Crusade, were the Venetians, and they remained the greatest power in the Eastern Mediterranean for many centuries. They were a match for any Islamic power, and when the Ottoman Turks took over the territories of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was necessary for the Turks to deal with the Venetians on a basis of equality, and there were continued wars between Venice and the Ottoman Empire well into the 18th century. The Venetians took Crete around 1207, and they held it until 1669, and again they held it briefly until 1715. And the southern part of Greece, the Peloponnese, was quite often a Venetian possession as well. And the Venetians eventually took over Cyprus from the Lusignan family and held it until 1571. And although the Venetians were forced on the defensive in the 16th century, they stabilized their position in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, after which the Turks lost control of the Eastern Mediterranean to a renewed Venetian hegemony, a hegemony that continued until late in the 17th century, when the Royal Navy, the English Navy, became the greatest power in the Mediterranean. So Venice had won the Fourth Crusade. There was no taking of Alexandria, no material help given to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Indeed, the weakening of the Byzantine Empire was a great strategic blow to the restored Kingdom of Jerusalem. It didn't matter, though, because Venice had got what it wanted, and Venice was content. And thereafter, Venice continued as a most devout Christian power. And there is Gentile Bellini's Procession of the True Cross in Venice, 1429 to 1507. Part of the booty from Constantinople was the seizure of a large fragment of the True Cross, and, as I said, being a most devout people, the Venetians were always very proud to possess this, and they showed it in public on all appropriate occasions. So that is the Venetian contribution to the Crusades. It's not the most edifying story one could tell, but it is an important part of the story, and it is, I hope you agree, a most interesting part of the story. But although there's much more I could say about it, as ever we're running out of time, so if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.